Uh, look, I just, I can only hope that they end this thing quickly.
Yeah.
And they would like to see it ended too. It's a difficult situation all around.
Maybe we'll get started.
If you're closer, you gotta be closer.
We are now going to get started. Hello, everybody up there on TV land. Okay, they got the waves. Good. Welcome, everyone. We're glad you're here. Jim Hawkins, we had a seat saved for you.
Thank you.
Everybody, thank you for being here. We're going to get started. We've got a very interesting program today. I think, of course, we all know that the resident patient is probably one of the more outstanding stories in the county. And since you heard it was coming, you were just ready and studying. And Shannon has been, and she is almost ready, but
She's not a has been. What are you talking about?
Billy.
I'm sorry. Before we get started, any show and tell, anything?
I got one thing.
Okay.
I brought these to Kathy. These were done in the 80s, the Homes In Federation. It's a seven, or I found out later there's an 8th book I don't have yet, but it's Holmes meets Star Trek. And this was done with just the original series. There was no Next Gen, Deep Space Nine. It was just the original guys. It's got some interesting stories. There's one full one about a Klingon getting loose in 1890s. In 1890s,
Can I get this?
Just step up closer.
How's that?
yeah, there's one book about a Klingon that gets loose in 1890 London, trying to kill Holmes to change the timeline.
No.
So each one of those is one story, right?
This one is. The rest of them are just multiple stories.
Okay.
But this one's a full novella. There's a group, a lady from Washington, I think, Landon. She did it, and I found out years later there's an 8th one out there, but I haven't been able to find a copy. But I brought these for Kathy to read and enjoy. And
Where did you find it? How did you find it?
I got them in the 80s.
Oh, okay.
I saw some advertisement, and I bought them all when they came out. But I think there's every once in a while they'll show up on eBay or.
Yeah, probably. If other people have copies, they probably put them up for sale.
But they're fun stories. I mean, there's also one where Holmes meets Gollum hires Holmes to find his birthday present. And I tried to write a story for it where Holmes meets Paul Atreides from Dune, but I never put pen to paper on that one.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll read them. I'll get them back sometime. So
Okay. Yeah.
enjoy.
I brought the.
You'll never see Patty again.
That's right.
This is the latest Nicholas Meyer pastiche, Sherlock Holmes and the Telegram from Hell. It's in a sense, it's a follow-up to his last bow. It's set in 1917, 1918, and involves espionage work. Holmes and Watson go to America and to Mexico. It's very engrossing. Not so much mystery, although there are elements of that, but it's just a thoroughly involving adventure, kind of historical. He really works well to integrate historical characters and fact into the plot, the story. They interact with a number of actual figures, and back he explains a lot of what is true and what is not. But it's great fun. So I highly recommend it, and I'll pass this around.
And I noticed you appropriately wrapped it to
Yes.
barbecue proof it.
Leave it in its bag.
As you should, barbecue proof it.
That's smart.
Anyone else?
I've got a jigsaw puzzle, kind of the Baskerville jigsaw puzzle.
Oh. And it's a wondrous thing.
Have you done the puzzle?
I've not.
Are there anything else? What about online,
Okay.
folks? Out there on
How
internet
many
land,
pieces?
anything y'all want to share with us in show and tell?
Oh, there it is. 252.
Nothing? Okay. Well, then,
Here we go.
you know, with that in mind, we are going to move quickly because we have a wondrous event. And certainly something we all as scholars look forward to annually is when Shannon Carlisle brings us a story. So Shannon, I'm gonna quit talking and it's yours.
You're good. Thank you. Thank you. Hello to those of you online. It's good to see each of you, and please stop me if you can't hear me. So. I'm gonna start my presentation with a show and tell. For those of you who don't know, my classroom is 221B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes' home. And 13 years ago, we created a museum because Sherlockians all across the world were sending me trinkets to share with my students. But some of the trinkets were so exceptional, I didn't want them going home with just one child. So we opened up the museum. In fact, Dr. Alvarez was there and Francine Kitts was there virtually because we dedicated the museum to those two individuals because they had been super supportive of our studies at that time. Well, I want to show you, if Jeff wouldn't mind starting the presentation. The newest exhibit is going to include some stuffed animals. So this summer, Jim Hawkins helped me connect with Judith Freeman, or Judith Freeman connect with me. So Judith Freeman, over time, has collected, I believe, all or most all of the animals found in the canon. And she was having to move this last summer from her apartment in New York City to an assisted living home, and she was looking for a new space for the animals. So Jim suggested my classroom. So this summer, her neighbor helped her ship 2 massive boxes to my house. And this first image you're going to see on the screen is of my son and I in my classroom this summer unpacking the 2 boxes.
Wow.
Now, Jeff, if you'll advance to the next slide, please.
How many animals are in the cannon?
I don't know. That's a
2
great
boxes for it,
question.
yeah, 2 boxes for
That's a
it.
great question. Okay, so this is a current image of the Sherlock Holmes Museum for the Young, Curious, and Observant Mind, our classroom museum. And it's a little bit more difficult to see, but there is currently a rope stretched across it with a tan colored sign. And Jeff, if you'll advance to the next slide, this is what the sign reads. The Sherlock Holmes Museum for the Young, Curious, and Observant Mind is temporarily closed until further notice. Look forward to the updated space. It will include the canonical animals, a gift by Judith Freeman, with warm Sherlockian regards, Dominique, Sunny, and Zach, the 4th grade curators. So actually, I currently have 10 4th grade students in my literacy class. 3 of them are a part of this first phase that has closed off the museum, and they are categorizing the animals by type. And then I have another group that will be creating a space for them within the museum. So we're gonna have to move around a few of the exhibits. And then a third group is going to be creating a placard to go with the animals. And they're also in the midst of composing an email for Judith. So we have learned a lot about Judith, but they still had some more questions. So they are going to be sending her an email here soon, asking her a little bit more about her Sherlockian adventures and a few more questions about the animals. And then they'll include that information in the placard. So that's my show and tell for today. So.
Very good, thank you.
Shannon,
So the rest. Oh, yes, sir.
let me just fill in a little bit. Judith Freeman was on our Welcome Homes discussion group for a long time, and actually took the group over when Ron Critter had to leave us. And she did a marvelous job. It's tough getting people to respond, but she went through the entire canon, I think, and just did a great job. And I had lunch with her at one time in New York City. And I don't know if Sandy Cozen was there. Maybe it was both of you, wasn't it?
Recording in progress.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Well, that's
Underwater version.
I'm
That's
sorry, I
what
was
it's like.
muted, Jim. Yes, it was the 3 of us when I had went out to dinner. Or lunch.
So I have a screenshot of an email between myself and Billy Fields this week. So at the very bottom of the screen is his message to me on November 8th. Hey, any tidbits from your presentation next Saturday you want me to tease to the scholars in the meeting announcements? And then my message is at the top. Ha 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 ha, not yet. Not quite sure why I picked this story. Not much to it. I'll come up with something though. So to be honest, I usually read a story and I know exactly what I'm going to do for the presentation. We're going to play a game or we're going to bring in artifacts. And after I read The Resident Patient, I was actually kind of disappointed that I picked this story. Okay? But the first thing I did is I combed my shelves for any inspiration, and then I combed the internet for inspiration. And I came across this blog post by Jamie Mahoney. So she has or had a blog by the title of Better Homes and Gardens. And on May 6th, 2012, she wrote the following. If you've ever been to a meeting of any of the many Sherlock Holmes science societies, you know that these meetings tend to be rather boisterous, rambunctious even, loud to put it in even more simple terms. Members laugh and shout and argue. It's all in good fun, even if it is rather spirited. So you can imagine my surprise when attending the most recent meeting of Watson's Tin Box, when the Gasogene opened up the discussion of The Resident Patient, only to be met with silence. It was an awkward silence, complete with cricket sounds and forced coughing. After waiting a moment for anyone to speak, the Gasogene finally prompted. So, I take it that none of you like this story. No, someone finally spoke up. Well, no, I wouldn't say that. Oh, you liked it then? Well, I wouldn't say that either, said another Tin Box member. I wouldn't say I feel much about the story either way. And that was the problem then. How does one verbalize, yeah? Is there even a way to discuss a story that appears to inspire such little feeling? Stories that are either greatly loved or greatly hated can inspire magnificent discussion. But a narrative that inspires no feeling likewise inspires no conversation. And relatively speaking, Sherlock Holmes doesn't really do very much in The Adventure of the Resident Patient to inspire any kind of traditional response. She goes on to say that there's actually quite a bit of information to gather about Sherlock Holmes, about his talents and methods, even if they were not on display to their fullest possible extent in this story. And then she goes on to say, we are reminded of, and if you'll flip to the next slide, his character, his power of deduction, and his friendship. And so the rest of the blog post is about those three things that we can be reminded of or learn about Sherlock Holmes. Under character, she wrote, Sherlock Holmes loved to lie in the center of 5 millions of people with his filaments stretching out and running through them. With the power of deduction, she highlights Holmes is able to catalog Watson's entire train of thought and is even able to accurately remind Watson of how this train of thought began there in the introduction of the tale. And then she also highlights friendship. It is a charming sketch of Sherlock Holmes and John Watson as friends. Dr. Watson is charmed by his friend and Holmes is at ease, at his best. So before we take a quiz on The Adventure of the Resident Patient, I thought I would just start with some curiosities and confusions. So the story was first published in the Strand magazine in August of 1893 in Britain, and then also here in the United States the same month in Harper's Magazine. Unfortunately, though, in Harper's Magazine, it was published over 3 pages, and page 1 of the 3 pages included this illustration. So unfortunately, a lot of the story was given away within the first page. Next. So another curiosity about the adventure of the resident patient is that, again, it was published in the Strand magazine in August of 1893, and then it became a part of the 12 tales published in the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes in December of that year. But the stories are not the same. So about 8 months before The Resident Patient was published, Arthur Conan Doyle had published The Cardboard Box in the Strand magazine. And that tale included the mind reading sequence that we find in the memoirs. Okay. So William Dorn, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about him in a moment, but he, one of the items I found, actually off my book, in my bookshelf, is his recount of how there are two tales of the adventure of the resident patient. Okay, so the mind reading sequence in The Cardboard Box was published in January in the Strand magazine. And then it was that same sequence was published in the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, but it became part of the resident patient tale. So in the memoirs, the second and third paragraphs of the resident patient were removed, and the mind reading sequence is pushed in its place, was inserted in that place. Now, later in his last bow, when The Cardboard Box was published, the mind reading sequence is there too. Let me go to the second paragraph. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Okay. So a lot of folks have wondered why The Adventure of the Cardboard Box was not published in the memoirs. But they have thought that Arthur Conan Doyle didn't think it'd be appropriate to use a story about marital infidelity in a book that would be more widely read than the Strand magazine. So that's Bill Dorn's opinion. And I've had some folks say they weren't quite sure why it didn't appear. I did bring my Doubleday though. In my Doubleday version, so the complete Sherlock Holmes, it is really cool to see that the resident patient is here. And the whole introduction, the mind reading sequence starts with, it had been a close rainy day in October. In the same book, so in my Doubleday, I've got The Adventure of the Cardboard Box. And it starts with a blazing hot day in August, and the mind reading sequence is there too. So that was clear as mud, and I apologize for that. I should have stuck with my script. That was my problem. But do know that there are several different versions of the resident patient. The first one in the Strand did not include the mind reading sequence we see in the older versions. And that's because Sir Arthur Conan Doyle plucked it from the Cardboard Box and placed it in this story when it was published in the memoirs. So later he had the Adventure of the Cardboard Box published in The Last Bow, and he kept the mind reading sequence there. So I want to introduce you to Bill Dorn. So during my very first weekend in New York City, my very first BSI weekend, January of 2016, I met Bill Dorn. Bill Dorn just recently passed away. He passed away in April. And I want to read a few passages from his obituary. Because as I read The Resident Patient, and then I read Jamie Mahoney's blog, I realized that friendship is at the heart of so much that we do as Sherlockians. And he was a good friend of mine. We had a lot of connections because he passed away in Denver, Colorado, which is where I spent about 24 years of my life. His obituary reads that he was a child of the Great Depression and his family struggled. This colored much of his life, and he was so grateful for the many opportunities had through his education, which was made possible through his service in the Army. He served for 6 years. Then when he was honorably discharged, he attended the Carnegie Institute of Technology, which is now Carnegie Mellon University. He earned a bachelor's of science in physics, and then a master's and a PhD in mathematics. He started his career at General Electric. He also taught at New York University. He worked at IBM in New York in their computer science research laboratory. But ultimately teaching was his destiny. So he moved his family to Denver in 1968 and began his teaching career at the University of Denver, which is also the university my husband attended. So another connection. He taught mathematics and computer science. In 1972, he received a Fulbright scholarship and spent a year at the Open University in England, looking at ways computers could be used in education. He taught for 30 years at DU. Now, the image you see on the right there, A Study Guide to Sherlock Holmes, is taken from the front cover of one of his 2 study guides. So that very first year I met him in New York, he also handed me these. I have both copies of them. And when my students read The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle or The Red-Headed Lady, they actually take a Bill Dorn quiz at the end, and whoever scores the highest gets a prize. So I thought today we would go ahead and take a Bill Dorn quiz for the resident patient. Okay. You'll advance to the next slide. So for those of you who are online, I have everything on the screen.
Once again, we'll be dumber than her pattern.
No. He'll pass
That's
us
not
now.
smarter than first grader though.
But for those of you who are here in person, here is a copy if it's difficult to see it on the screen.
Oops. Here you go.
So you don't.
Yeah, which I use actually shown.
So Bill has tiered his questions. So you start with the simple quiz, and then you go on to the intermediate quiz, and then finally the advanced quiz. And we're gonna go ahead and just go through the quiz together so that those folks that are online can experience it with us. So the very first question is, the resident patient was killed by poison, a stab wound, hanging, or none of the above. Hanging is correct, and if you'll advance to the next slide. Beautiful, okay. Well, yeah, next slide.
You can find poison in them,
Okay, the resident patient was killed because he buried a valuable treasure, he betrayed his friends, his murderers would inherit his wealth, or none of the above.
He betrayed his friends.
Yeah, he betrayed his friends. And number 3, the murderers of the resident patient were captured by Sherlock Holmes, killed by the police, not found, or none of the above.
Not found.
Not found is correct. Okay. So before we move on, I did want to just highlight a few items from the simple quiz. So the resident patient was killed by hanging, but not of his own accord.
No pun intended. Accord. Dean, I was waiting for you, buddy.
Just hang around.
It was just too easy. You needed a straight man.
Okay. The resident patient was killed because he betrayed his friends. So Blessington, also known as Sutton, had turned informer. He was a part of the Worthington Bank gang who had murdered a caretaker and stole 7,000 pounds. His evidence was what got his other 3 friends 15 years in prison. But who was, well, that might be one of the questions I had. I better stop there. Okay. And then number 3, the murderers of the resident patient were not found. It was surmised at Scotland Yard that they were probably passengers of the ill-fated steamer. Does anyone remember by the name of?
Crying,
Yeah.
Nova something.
Nora.
Nora Carena.
That's right. And it most likely went down off the coast of
Portuguese.
Portugal. Okay, now on to the intermediate quiz. Also, I do have to say my students love taking his quizzes because usually the D, none of the above, is never the right answer. So just FYI. Okay, what American is mentioned in this story?
Henry Ward Beecher.
Yes, correct. And he was a U.S. congregational minister and militant opponent of slavery. And he traveled to Britain and helped turn British settlement against the
Confederacy.
South. You're right. That's right. Okay, number 2. What kind of attacks was the elderly Russian gentleman supposedly subjected to?
Epilepsy.
Yes. Good. Which is a seizure or trance in which sensation and consciousness are suspended. Every day, Blessington settled his accounts with Dr. Trevelyan. After doing so, where did Blessington put his share of the money?
In the strong box.
Yes, in the strong box. And then I found it interesting that when Dr. Trevelyan was describing Blessington's suicide, he assumed he jumped off the top of that box. And I think there could be some symbolism there. Okay.
What is a strong box?
Ooh,
Just a big one.
Metal usually.
metal. And number 4, which one of the following was not a member of the Worthington Bank Gang? Yes, yep. Okay, so those top 3, Middle, Moffat, and Sutton, well, Sutton also known as Blessington. Biddle, Moffat, and one other were the ones that were in prison for 15 years. You remember the name of the third one?
Cartwright?
We'll
No,
talk
sorry.
about Cartwright soon. Hayward. Okay. And now let's advance to the advanced
You mentioned
quiz.
strong box, and as I was
Yeah.
just thinking about banks, I immediately went to, when I think of a strong box, I think of the American West, and I think of a strong box in a stagecoach,
Yeah,
which came from a bank, and there were a couple of feet, maybe 18 inches long and a foot wide. And I mean, there would have been a pretty good size box.
Is it just like an old fashioned like safe?
safe.
Just a portable safe. You could call it a portable safe, I guess, probably with a big lock on the front of it.
Okay.
And
Or at
there's a
least that's
certain
what Corey Roberts said.
I was saying there's a certain humor that he did. He said, "I don't trust banks," says the bank robber.
Well, that's.
Good point.
that's a
Good point.
reason.
Oh.
But they kept them up in the stagecoach. They kept them up.
All right, number 1. After arriving at the scene of death, how long did Watson say Blessington had been dead?
Not more than 3
Yes.
hours.
And based on what?
Rigidity.
That's right.
Yeah. Rigor mortis.
Okay, number 2. According to Watson, what was the population of London at the time of this case? That's right, 5 million.
Whoa.
And then the second paragraph of the story, Watson states Sherlock Holmes loved to lie in the very center of 5 million people with his filaments stretching out and running through them. Number 3.
That recalls Moriarty, it's about the center of his web. Yeah. Parallel to that.
Number 3, what was the name of the police inspector in the case?
Lanner.
That's right. And I found it interesting, kind of the tone he used when he first spotted Sherlock Holmes. He was delighted to see him enter the crime scene. Welcome, Holmes. Yeah, right. And number 4, where were Dr. Trevelyan's consulting rooms at the time the story began? Brook Street. Brook Street is correct. Yep. And that was the house that Blessington secured, furnished, paid the maids, ran the whole place. And Dr. Trevelyan was just expected to wear out the consulting room. Yep. Okay, now, on this next slide, I do have a picture of houses in Brook Street. Now, this is 1906, so it's a little bit, this photo was taken later than what when the story was published. This can be found in this book, Sherlock Holmes in London, by Charles Viney. And I just enjoyed looking at the photographs of London as I'm reading the story, so. Okay. Also, before I hand it over to you all to ask you about your curiosities and confusions, I also brought with me one of Bill Dorn's books. So he published Sherlockian books, mathematics books, computer science books. This is one of my favorites though, The Dogs of Sherlock Holmes. And I've shared this with my students. So in any story in which a dog is present, Bill Dorn has rewritten the story, but from the dog's point of view. So it's very clever. It's a lot of fun.
So those would be the canonical.
That's a good one.
In fact, Judith Freeman, she does play around with the canon too, and calls her collection the animals. So yeah. Okay, so that was my presentation. Resident patient. Again, I was very disappointed. I picked the story at the beginning. But after combing my bookshelves and after combing the internet, I was reminded that, well, I was taught I wasn't the only one who had the same feelings about the resident patient. But I did like what Jamie Mahoney said. She said it also highlighted their friendship. And then I continued to come across Bill Dorn's items. Okay. Became a good friend, a Sherlockian, a great friend. And so in the end, I have enjoyed my presentation. So
Well done.
Thank you.
thank you. But did you all have any other curiosities or confusions related to this story?
I have a comment. When I was looking up, I like to look up the backgrounds to things in the stories. And when I looked up catalepsy or cataplexy, I ran across it has several different potential causes. And you remember in the story, Holmes mentions it was relatively easy to fake it and he'd done it himself. But I found, interestingly enough, one of the potential causes of catalepsy is recovery from cocaine use. So Holmes's experience of catalepsy might not have been just faking it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, I saw that comment, there's all this list of all the untold cases that occurred with canon. I thought that comment always indicated an untold case. It's usually not included in those lists, but that there's an untold case about when he used catalepsy itself.
Yes.
Somebody needs to write it up. So.
Yes, they do, because he says it was easy. It was easy to pretend. Yeah.
Holmes kind of blew it in not taking measures to be sure that the man was protected. If he felt that he was being menaced and he had a good sense of that, he could have done something to protect the guy. And so in a sense, it was lax on his part if the man was killed.
Which is not the first time. What was it, one egregious example of that?
Didn't they say that, he left with disgust, so he may already kind of identify Blessington's identity and didn't really want to protect.
I was thinking about that myself because this supposedly occurred in 1875. Holmes recognized him when he went and looked at a picture, found a picture of him in police records. But in 1875, Holmes would have already been sort of starting his practice, I believe. So, I mean, it would have been well, maybe a little before then, but he would already been fascinated by crime. So it's possible Holmes already knew what he looked like. And, just was willing to leave him to his fate if he wouldn't help himself.
The other point about him not protecting somebody, the worst case of that, of course, is in the 5 Orange Pip, where he just sends him off, basically be killed. And it's kind of irresponsible.
And that also is parallel in that the culprits escape and then sink in a ship off that ship.
Maybe.
Maybe, I suggest.
I don't believe it at all.
Nevertheless, they had that parallel storyline.
It was interesting toward the beginning of the story where Holmes breaks a beaker of a chemistry experiment, says a wasted day. You don't see him bundle things too much in the canon. No.
I thought it was a
Conan
powerful
Doyle.
visual.
Conan Doyle seems to use the sinking ship trick a lot. It's a good way to get rid of people.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Noted.
Yeah. Oh, another comment about the different versions of it. I think there's I think there's at least 2, maybe 3 versions of it. In one of the ones I found online, it both includes it being a rainy day in October, but has Watson commenting that my term of service in India had trained me to stand heat better than cold, and the thermometer of 90 was no hardship. Now that makes sense in the version in the cardboard box, I think, where it's a blazing day in August. But for a English day in October, the thermometer of 90 comment doesn't seem to make much sense. It's probably that particular version, the mashup wasn't quite edited properly.
Well, they also allude to the Parliament in that also, and that Parliament was, what, were they in session or just out of session? And so that didn't match up either with the months.
And the third version that I read was when the canon was collected in 1928 for the first time in one volume. Someone removed the cardboard box section, but substituted a different paragraph. It was just a transitional one. Just basically, okay, Watson, let's go out and take a walk. So I don't know who added that, whether it was Doyle, because he was still alive then, or the editor of that collected edition. And I don't know why they didn't just restore the Strand version.
Well, I thought that there was a mental visual from the deal, or at the end, we've got this man hanging the rafters and all this stuff, but they talked a lot about how fat he was. And somehow they just made it more repulsive, you had the crime, and then victim wasn't looking at his best, let's put it that way.
And the way his neck was stretched, it was really rather grisly.
Yeah.
Compared it to a chicken.
Okay. Other thoughts?
I watched the Brett version last night. I always try to do that when it's adaptation of the stories. And it added a couple of scenes at the beginning and another at the end, which were really quite clever. The opening scene was Carrington, what was his name? The victim, Blessington, having a nightmare. and
Right.
going downstairs, seeing himself in a coffin, going back upstairs, seeing himself in bed, and then waking up. And that was followed by a scene with Holmes and Watson in a barber shop, with Watson being shaved and cut and deducing what Holmes is thinking as he sits there, and then Holmes correcting him, saying, "No, actually, this is what it was." Although you get the sense, yeah, Watson was right, but Holmes was about to let him, admit that he was right.
Oh, that's fun.
Really clever. And then at the end, behind the closing credits, Watson is beginning to write up the story. First, Holmes is playing a violin, and Watson says, "Please, I'm trying to write this up. Could you please go somewhere else, do that?" And he mentions he's thinking of calling it the Brook Street murder mystery, something like Brook Street murder mystery. And Holmes says, "Well, I would think I'd call it the Recitation." And he walks off, but you do what you want. So then it's Watson sitting there and thinking, and you see him mouthing it, and he writes it down, and he runs nice through it. He tries another version of the title, and then he runs through that and finally writes the Recitation. That's the end. It was really a very well done adaptation. That was one of the early ones, 1985. So all of those are good. Made me like the story more, actually.
Yeah, that's.
Anything else? Shannon, thank you very much. We will, our January meeting, will be, we'll certainly have a meeting, but that'll be similar to ours that we normally have, but as you know, our dear friend Gail Stahl has left us. And there's certainly a void in our lives, not just our club's lives, but in our side's life, but in our personal lives because of what he's done for us and the role he played. And we all have stories, and I'm hoping that in January, whether you're online or where you're going to be here with us, you will bring a story. Not a 2-hour story, but some moments that we'll be able to share. We're going to be putting together a program. We've got we have an outline already. We're going to put some more detail to it, and we'll announce where the meeting is going to be, because it probably won't be here. Again, there's a lot of logistics when you start trying to do restaurants. It's always amazing trying to find a meeting location, but we'll work that out, and we'll certainly look forward to celebrating a very special Sherlockian life. And a multifaceted life. We'll hopefully be able to share some things that some of you may not know about Gail and his personal adventures from Kansas to Tennessee and finally to Indiana. Before we close, Sandy, be ready. We're going to be calling on you in a moment. Is anything before we close out the meeting here? We're a little early.
Do we have the date for that January?
Well, thank you. The meeting we normally would be on January the 18th. That is the BSI weekend. Now, we have got 3 locals so Jim and Bill and Shannon, I don't mind having a meeting on the 18th, but I don't want to do it if y'all can't be here, if you intend to be here. Are you going to New York, Shannon? Mm-hmm. You're not, Bill?
No.
Jim?
I'm not going.
Okay. Again, it's a BSI weekend. I'll defer to our BSI members. Any problem with just going ahead and meeting on the 18th?
Not with me.
No, that's good.
That's good.
Okay. All right. Well, because I do not want to be offensive to our exalted members.
Headquarters.
So we will plan on meeting on January the 18th.
That will mean, of course, that Marino can't join us on Zoom.
Because that is true. Marino.
If that's a factor at all, and I don't know that it is. But I don't know if of course, there's anybody on Zoom that's BSI probably.
Yeah.
That's something to think about.
All right. Well, we will roll it around. We'll make a call or two and see if we can find out about anybody else's schedule. We will go forward and put together something that will hope will be very appropriate. Anything else before we close?
Billy,
Sandy, do you have, something to share with us today?
Indeed, I do. Oh, wait a minute. Indeed, I do, yes. And this is a double today. To practice, Trevelyan needed money. Blessington made a deal, a real honey. When his partners in crime caught up with him in time, he learned hanging around wasn't funny. As ye sow, so surely shall you reap. Though quite rich, Blessington was too cheap. He made a bargain that stung, but in the end he was hung. The price Blessington paid was quite steep. The end.
Ow.
Sandy, is there any other business before the group? Anyone online, any business?
Billy? Billy, can you hear me?
Yes.
I have Gail's 221B if you'd like to hear it. For the end of the
Perfect.
meeting.
Perfect. Would you please play that and let's close it?
Any other stuff you need to do? Because we'll probably close out with this.
Close with this. You go right ahead.
Okay.
Okay. 221B by Vincent Starrett, BSI. Here dwell together two men of note who never lived and so can never die. How very near they seem, yet how remote. That age before the world went awry. But still the game's afoot for those with ears, attuned to catch the distant few halloo. England is England yet, for all our fears. Only those things the heart believe are true. A yellow fog settles past the window pane as night descends upon this fabled street. A lonely hansom splashes through the rain. The ghostly gas lamps fall at 20 feet.
Yes.
Here, though the world explodes, these two survive. And it's always 1895. Here, here.
You got, yeah,